Marcy. On the way back from South America, I felt nauseous. Don't get me wrong, we had done a lot of good work providing a surgical team to support the work of Médecins Sans Frontières in 5 different countries. I was concerned about how I would be welcomed home. I told Rick honestly about why I left and my intention to change. I believed I had acted more than honestly by arranging with our neighbor, the lovely Leslie, for sexual availability during the 6 weeks I would be away and sharing Trey's bed. I was disappointed that she never contacted me, since we had agreed that she would contact us when she first slept with Rick. In fact, when I tried to call her, all my calls went to voicemail. But I knew Rick had a thing for her, so the chances of him turning down a babe like her, who even her husband encouraged to sleep around, were slim to none. Besides, he had no incentive to sniff around that smug slut Deirdre, whom I was sure he'd had for years. Still, he was a proud man, and understandably pissed off when he finally tracked me down in Trey's bedroom on the 3rd day of our absence. If Leslie had given him my damn note the day I left, he wouldn't have called Penny to find out where I was. I prayed he wouldn't tell Josh that Graham was in her room when he talked to her. She plans to start a family next year. Trey's attitude didn't help either. He knew Rick was serving, but why did he have to act so arrogant toward the man who piloted a freaking Apache gunship helicopter in combat? That's a hell of a way to pounce on a damn bear. Anyway, I asked Rick not to make a scene at the airport and hoped he would be reasonable. If he waited for me at the Ambassador Hotel like I suggested, he could serve me and leave, or we could show each other the results of our STD tests and reunite in the room I'd booked all those weeks ago, and then we could enjoy the rest of our lives together. As nauseous as I felt on the plane, it was nothing compared to the churning in my stomach as I walked out of baggage claim and into the arrivals hall. I looked around. Thank God, Rick wasn't there. I said goodbye to my friends and co-workers and caught a cab to the hotel. Otherwise, I would have gone with Penny. As I entered the hotel lobby, I experienced perhaps the most nerve-wracking moment of my life. Would Rick be there? Would he hand me divorce papers instead? None of that was really happening. Did that mean he took the other option I offered him and just left without saying a word? I hoped he loved me more than that. To make sure, I walked up to the counter and gave my name to the girl at the front desk. "Are there any messages for me?" I asked, hoping rather than expecting. She smiled at me. "No, your husband picked up the keys a couple hours ago and went straight upstairs. Would you like me to call your room?" I brightened. "No, I'll join him. I feel like I've been traveling for days." She smiled again, prepared a key card for me, and after wishing me a good day, moved on to the next guest. When I opened the door and entered, calling his name, I was surprised to find him already in bed. I knew I'd asked him to abstain from sex for the last week while we waited for the STD tests that would confirm we were clean after our time out, but that seemed a little too pushy, especially since he hadn't had any problems with Leslie in over a month. Then I heard a noise coming from the bathroom. "You're not alone!" I exclaimed resentfully. "This was supposed to be our time, a chance to reconnect and put everything behind us. Why is she, I meant Leslie, of course, in our room?" "Hello to you too, Marcy." There was sarcasm in his voice. Things were not going according to plan. "Well," he continued when I didn't say anything back, "funny story. 6 weeks ago, your sexual adventure, at least for you, seemed well packaged and ready to begin. But from my point of view, by the time Leslie decided to pass me your note, I had only just found out that my wife was a cheating whore and got the full measure of both you and that fat wife-kidnapping bastard I already warned you about." He held up a hand to stop my reply. He frowned. "For your information, there are 3 groups of people you should never joke with: family, friends, and enemies." He looked at me to make sure I understood him. "The first 2 are obvious. They involve betrayal on both sides. That has to hurt. The latter is probably, by some standards, even worse. This fucking asshole who spent the last 6 weeks thinking he's the fucking alpha because everyone around him treats him like his shit doesn't stink. But I think he's a puffed-up little narcissist, and he knows it. You made yourself the trophy in our swiping contest, and he won by getting him into bed, not me. My wife had to choose between him and me, and she chose him. That really hurt." "No," I protested. I just wanted to rest, and he was there for me and ready. I agree, he's an asshole, and I was just using him as an imitator. He's a nobody to me. But Leslie... I nodded toward the bathroom door, then turned to Rick again. We had an understanding. It was 5 weeks, and then we both abstained. For a moment, he looked confused. Then his face cleared. Oh, no. Leslie waited for me to approach her those 3 days before pouncing on me because you lied to her. He looked at me accusingly. You told her we talked about her and that I was on board. When I showed her the note she brought when I still hadn't made a move on her, she got upset. She called Vincent, and he realized why I seemed so nonchalant when we passed each other on the street. It was because I didn't understand anything. They were both so infuriated by the way you used lies to implicate them in your scheme, especially when you admitted it could lead to our divorce, that he withdrew his consent. They had no interest in ruining our marriage. It would have been humiliating to Leslie if they had been dragged into our divorce. I've hardly spoken to them since then. Now I was confused. Then she spoke. Hello, Marcy. You're here sooner than we expected. No. I couldn't hear her voice behind me. Please, God, not her. Anyone but her. Rick looked past me and smiled. All set? All right, sweetheart. I'll see you later. Around 6? I turned and saw her. Deirdre, stunning in a short black dress, bare skin still glistening after a shower, and undoubtedly sex. I stood in agonizing silence as she gathered her things, kissed my husband, and left. Finally, I found my voice. Why, Rick? Why her? I gasped in horror. We had unfinished business, he explained calmly. You convinced yourself that she and I were lovers, and this 6-week affair of yours was your revenge. He moved in his bed. I'll admit, in one instance, we went way overboard. He looked thoughtful. But I was warned that you seemed to be having an affair as well, so in order not to bring our marriage to an end, I made sure to bury my feelings and not go overboard again. He looked me straight in the eye. I never slept with Deirdre, and we never slept together. And when you gave yourself a 6-week pass for me to do just that, I thought, damn, if I'm paying penance, I might as well commit a sin. My heart dropped. I knew to my core that he was telling the truth. But here and now, I protested. Even if you're telling the truth, it has to be over. He looked at me perplexed. Why? You'd already been sleeping with Trey in Bogota for 3 days, refusing my calls before I guessed your plans. He shook his head. You told me we were both single and then insulted me by trying to put me in a situation you can control while you sleep with a guy I hate. He looked at me so coldly. And you also insulted me by expecting me to agree to a 6-week pass when you admitted that you had already let Trey know ahead of time what to expect while you were gone. As far as I'm concerned, your betrayal began the minute you decided to use Leslie as an acceptable surrogate bitch. And those were her parting words, not mine. My world was crumbling. I had just pushed it to the point where I was now paying for it. I tried to regain control of myself. But the last week, Rick, we had to abstain, to prove we were clean. He laughed. I told you I started at least 3 days after you did, even considering you admit you started your sordid affair before you left. It took another week to contact Deirdre and convince her to join me, and then to wait for the results of our first tests. Deirdre and I are only partway through week 4, so even by your twisted logic, you're still married, and I'm free for over 2 more weeks. And by the way, if you really think I'm going to believe that you and that asshole haven't touched each other once in the last week, you're even more deluded than I thought. He must have seen my reaction. That's what I thought, was all he said. You told her, Deirdre. You said you'd see her later, I said quietly, my anger replaced by resignation. Right, he agreed. We're flying out tonight. I don't see the point of paying for a hotel room so close to home, and I'm not stupid or insensitive enough to keep sleeping with Deirdre in our house, so we've decided to spend a couple weeks together at the beach. I reread his words. What do you mean by keep sleeping together? Where are you? Oh, God, no, not again. Please tell me, just not in our bed. This time I was sure the puzzled look on his face was genuine. What? Having Leslie in our bed was okay because you chose her, but you expected me to take Deirdre to a cheap motel to spare your feelings? Did you? This was the angriest I'd ever seen him. You dare stand here after your cowardly note about thinking you're a bachelor and then complain about me taking one woman of my own choosing into my bed? Listen, bitch, he growled. I instinctively recoiled. While I was waiting for Deirdre to join me, all I could imagine was you being a whore all over South America. I started to sob. Penny, please tell me. He interrupted me. Of course I freaking told Josh. He spat out the words. Look at your own reprisals for something you only imagined I did. I knew exactly what Penny was doing. Why is it okay for you to retaliate and not him? Josh deserved to know what I knew. Think about it, wife. There was venom in his voice. If you'd had the decency to return my calls, to talk to me, your husband, when I first tried to reach you, I never would have known, and neither would he. He stood up and headed for the bathroom. I was left standing where I had stopped when I first entered the room. I remembered how he had once uttered one of his trite military sayings, "No plan of operations extends with any certainty beyond the first encounter with the enemy's main forces." When I scoffed at that, he pulled me up on it, pointing out that the enemy almost certainly has a plan too, and it certainly contradicts yours. My plan, Trey, Leslie, and the subsequent reconciliation here in this very room was in shreds. If I had met with him after Deirdre's visit, we could have talked, even if we had argued or fought. But planning an ambush against a professional soldier, what kind of fool was I? I escaped before he came out of the bathroom. Epilogue. Rick blocked me on his phone, and I didn't communicate with him for over 2 weeks after I escaped. Then he called me from Deirdre's apartment. He had 2 questions. Did I believe that now that we had both survived the betrayal of a spouse who had cheated with someone we despised, that we had a chance to rebuild the marriage and the retired life together that I had spoken so lovingly of in my note? And did I believe he would sit there, happy, in his twilight years, looking lovingly at me, his tarnished silver trophy wife, his second-place prize, his willingly soiled goods, his leftovers from the rich surgeon's table? The next day I filed for divorce. We haven't spoken since. The kids were appalled by my behavior and still hardly ever call. Our few conversations are scrappy at best. I haven't seen either of them since I got back. Rick, of course, showed them my letter. He wouldn't let me off the hook that easily. Leslie and Vincent are ignoring me, and I'm starting to realize that as my notoriety spreads, I'm being excluded from the neighborhood hangouts more and more. I'll probably have to move somewhere smaller when the house sells anyway, preferably closer to the hospital. Penny, who used to be my friend, hadn't spoken to me since she'd been served at the airport. Rick was right. I stood and applauded when she did exactly what I accused him of doing. And at the same time, I was angry at Rick for telling her husband everything. What happened to Trey? He was unbearably smug for a few weeks, then he became anxious, then paranoid. He was convinced that Rick had recruited some army buddies who were watching him with the intent of hurting him. I tried to convince him that it was just his imagination, although Rick certainly knew people capable of such things. His conviction grew more and more certain, though I didn't notice anyone. His restlessness even began to affect his work. About 3 months after our return, we had lunch together, and I tried again to convince him that my husband had no interest in him and was not such a vindictive person. The young resident at the next table leaned over to me and apologized for eavesdropping. Her words ended Trey's stay at the hospital. "I'm sorry to interrupt you, but wasn't your husband's job, while in a war zone, to fly an attack helicopter and fire cannon shells and rockets into enemy-held buildings to kill or maim as many people as possible?" Trey left that evening and never returned. I found out months later that she was a reservist. To this day, I don't know if Rick put her up to it, or if it was just loyalty to one of her own that made her get involved. Honestly, I don't think Rick was involved. He knew that Trey didn't really steal me, and I gave myself a way to get even. If it wasn't Trey but someone else, why would Rick waste time on a useless, symbolic revenge? He had Deirdre now. He was fine. "I took care of him in Iraq," Deirdre told me, and those few words made me do the stupidest and most rash thing I could imagine. She was my Trey, my enemy, the person I despised. Because of my jealousy, I gave my husband another chance to choose between her and me, but this time I lost. Damn it, she played me and won.